I shall use the blackboard, so if you wish to follow, I think it's preferable that you sit in the first half of the room, which is quite deep. Okay. But of course, if you wish to do other things during my talk, you may stand in the rear. That's not a problem. Besides, I speak today only for those who are not familiar with hyperbolic things. So this means that a few people here, please feel free if you have, if you need a coffee, a tea, if you have an appointment to go away. Okay, I don't mind. So I shall begin with the notion of hyperbolicity. May I have genuine chokes and not only just chunks of chokes? Oh yes, oh yeah, good, very good. So what is hyperbolicity? To understand it, you first consider a linear constant coefficient PDE. So you have a polynomial P of differential operators, an unknown U, and maybe a right-hand side, the data F. Okay, so P is a polynomial. And I have specified two kinds of independent variables, the time variable and the space variable. So X is in RD to fix notations, and T is a time. And you are interested in the Cauchy problem. I shall make a crucial assumption that the order of the equation with respect to time equals the order of the equation in all variables. Order, which means that the degree of P with respect to T equals the total degree of P. This rules out, for instance, the heat equation. The heat equation does not fill this assumption because it is only first order in time and second order in space. So no heat equation. But it allows, for instance, it allows the wave equation. It allows also Laplace equation in space and time for the moment. Now, perhaps I shall denote M this degree, and therefore the Cauchy problem consists in giving the initial values of U and derivatives at time t equals 0, derivatives up to m minus 1. So you have m initial data. So this is the Cauchy problem. And under this unique assumption, there is a well-posedness result. It is the Cauchy-Kovalevskaya theorem, but it stands for analytic data and the existence and uniqueness result is only local in time. So it is useless for applications. It is very nice, but it is useless for applications. It does not distinguish between the wave equation and the Laplace equation. Okay. So what is much more interesting is well-posedness result in the C-infinity class, or even better in HS in L2, for instance. And this question was addressed by Lars Garding. At least he solved the question in C-infinity. But this almost solves the HS question. So Lars Garding, that was in the end of the 50s, if I remember well. Nice papers in Acta Mathematica. And he proved the following, that so the first theorem is that the Cauchy problem is C-infinity well-posed. So because C-infinity is a semi-normed space, it is a Fréchet space, well-posedness comes with a priori estimates. But of course, these a priori estimates, they may suffer some loss of a finite number of derivatives. So it is not the well-posedness that we do like, the one in HS, for instance, a normed space, but it is good nevertheless. So it is C-infinity well-posed if and only if the following property holds. So maybe I shall rephrase this assumption by saying that this means that P of 1 and 0 is non-zero. Okay? And without loss of generality, I may assume that it is a positive number. Okay? So if and only if P is a hyperbolic polynomial. So actually the terminology is that of Garding. And it means the following, that for every vector C in Rd, the polynomial, the univariate polynomial S gives P of S and C. This is a polynomial of degree m, exactly m, because P of 1 and 0 is non-zero. This polynomial has its n roots real. A priori, they could be complex, they could occur by pairs, complex conjugate pairs, of course, but the polynomial is hyperbolic if all the roots are real. So this is hyperbolicity. Now, before continuing speaking about PDEs, let me mention that hyperbolic polynomials are ubiquitous objects in mathematics. They occur in a very important way in several areas. For instance, combinatorics, optimization, real algebraic geometry, several complex variables, and so forth. And to give an even more impressive opinion. Let me say that the Alfred Horn's conjecture about the eigenvalues of the sum of two Hermitian matrices. The Alfred Horn conjecture is a statement about some hyperbolic polynomial, and in some sense it is a universal statement about, about every hyperbolic polynomial, and its solution, its complete solution, was one of the great achievements for which Terence Tao was awarded a Fields Medal. So far so good. Now, Garding proved a number of other results about hyperbolic polynomials. First of all, he defines a cone, gamma, as the connected component of the vector 1, 0, at which P is non-zero, in the complement of the zero set of P, which is the characteristic set. This is the characteristic set of a PDE. And he proves that gamma is convex. And in addition, he proves a very nice statement which does not tell us much about PDEs, but which is very useful in other topics involving hyperbolic polynomials. He proved that the restriction of P to the power 1 over m, m being the degree, this restriction to gamma, it is well defined because over gamma P takes positive values. Okay. This restriction is concave. And an application of this fact is that if you consider the determinant of a positive definite symmetric matrix, of size n, n times n positive definite symmetric matrix, take the determinant to the power 1 over n, then this is concave. Perhaps you know a well-known result that the logarithm of the determinant is concave. But this statement is always stronger. Of course, it is n dependent. It is size dependent. Whereas if you take just the log, it is not size dependent. So, now, what is the importance of gamma? It comes when you study the changes of variables. What you can always do is to replace t on x by some t prime on x prime, and you assume that this change of variable is linear. So it takes your linear equation and it rewrites it as a new equation, p prime of dt prime gradient x prime u equals blah blah blah. So you have a new equation, but you also actually it's the same. It is just rewritten in different coordinates. But now, if you consider the Cauchy problem for the new equation, the Cauchy problem with data given at t prime equals 0, then it is certainly different from the original Cauchy problem, because the hyperplane t equals 0 and the hyperplane t prime equals 0 are not the same. So you have a different Cauchy problem for the same equation. A different Cauchy problem for the same equation. You have replaced the initial hypersurface t equals 0 by an initial hypersurface t prime equals 0. Well, you can always characterize a hypersurface by a normal, by its normal. So the normal to t equals 0 was the vector 1, 0. And here you have another normal, let's say nu. And now the theorem of Garding is that if nu belongs to the cone gamma, then P prime is hyperbolic. Which means that the Cauchy problem is still well posed. So this suggests a terminology. First of all, contrary to the elliptic case, when we speak about hyperbolic operator, hyperbolic differential equations, we should always specify in which direction the equation is hyperbolic. It is hyperbolic in the direction of time. Actually, the direction is a normal. Okay? So, one says that P is hyperbolic in some direction. And we must specify which direction. And actually, when it is hyperbolic in some direction, then it is hyperbolic in all the directions of the cone gamma. So it is in all directions nu in gamma. And gamma is called the cone of future. And there is no unique time direction. All the directions in gamma, in the cone gamma, may be time directions. And this is reminiscent to the special relativity. In special relativity, there is no unique choice of space and time variables. You may make linear change of variables which do not distinguish a canonical time variable, but you cannot make an arbitrary linear change of variables, because if you just switch t on x1, for instance, x1 will not be a time variable. Okay? So in special relativity, you have a cone of future, and it is a particular case of this situation. Well, so the general definition of hyperbolicity is this one. Definition: P is hyperbolic in direction nu if on the one hand, P of nu is non-zero, and on the other hand, for every vector in Rd plus 1, then the equation, the polynomial equation P of S nu plus eta, which is of degree m, the degree of P, has real roots, only real roots.
You have two arguments, so you always consider the second.
Here I have put Rd plus 1, so nu is a vector in Rd plus 1. It affords for both tau and xi. Okay. Good. Now, in my case, and in the case of several of my colleagues here, I work on systems instead of scalar equations. But systems and equations are not very much different. You may always rewrite an equation of order m as a system of m equations of first order. It's exactly like in ordinary differential equations. So the theory for systems contains all the theory of hyperbolic equations. And we may just focus on first order systems. So if I continue with linear constant coefficient equations, I have dtu plus the sum of a alpha d alpha u equals some data. And now u is vector valued. So u of xt belongs to Rn. N is the number of equations. And A alpha are matrices with real coefficients. Now, to understand whether the system is hyperbolic, that is, whether the Cauchy problem is C infinity well posed, you form, like here, you form the symbol. So you form first a matrix symbol by replacing ddt by a scalar tau and replacing dd alpha by a scalar xi alpha. So this gives you a matrix which depends on d plus 1 arguments, and now you take the determinant, and this will be our polynomial of d plus 1 variables, and it will have degree n. And you see that p of 1 on 0 is non-zero, it is 1. Okay. And if p is a hyperbolic polynomial, then the system is hyperbolic, the Cauchy problem is C infinity well posed. Now, what does hyperbolicity mean in this case? Well, this sum, you call it A of xi. Now, for xi given, the roots of P are just the opposite of the eigenvalues of A of xi. So hyperbolicity amounts to saying that for every xi in Rd, the eigenvalues of A of xi are real. Now, hyperbolicity is not enough to, in order to have well-posedness in Sobolev spaces. I mean without loss of derivatives in the estimates. So if you really want that your Cauchy problem generates some I group in some Banach space, actually in some Sobolev space, then you need a little more, but not much. So for a semi-group, say in HS over D, one needs, and this is a theorem due to Heinz Otto Kreis in the 70s. A very little more. We need that not only the eigenvalues are real, but also A is diagonalizable. Of course, we need also that the eigenvalues are real, but this is the little more that we need. There is another little more. This has to be uniform. So uniformly with respect to Xi, which means the following uniformly. A of Xi is diagonalized. So P of Xi is a change of, is a change of basis. D of Xi is diagonal, real. And the uniformity is that the condition number of P of Xi is bounded with respect to Xi, is uniformly bounded. So this is the condition number, the product of the norms of P of Xi and its inverse. This seems to be a very strong assumption. Actually, it is not so strong because of the following. Since A of Xi depends linearly in Xi, you see that you can choose P of Xi so that it depends on Xi in an homogeneous way, that it is homogeneous of degree 0, say. Okay? And therefore it is enough to restrict this supremum to unit vectors of Xi. Of course, there is no problem in Xi equals 0 because the matrix is 0. The matrix A is 0. Now, this is really an if and only if. The Kreis theorem tells that the Cauchy problem in H is well posed in HS if and only if A of Xi is real diagonalizable in a uniform way. Now, this leads us to two main classes of hyperbolic systems. The first one is the class of Friedrichs symmetrics. Symmetric systems, which means that A alpha is a symmetric matrix for every alpha. And we can be a bit more general by asking only symmetrizability, which means that there exists an S0 which is positive definite such that the matrix S alpha defined as the product S0 A alpha is symmetric. But actually this is not more general because we can pass from the symmetric class to the symmetrizable class and back just by a change of unknowns, a linear change of the unknowns. So it's exactly the same class. Why it ensures hyperbolicity? Just because, let me consider the symmetric case. In the symmetric case, A of xi is symmetric and therefore is diagonalizable with real eigenvalues in an orthonormal basis. So you can choose P of xi in the orthogonal group, in which case, of course, this product equals to 1. So it is well conditioned. Now the other class is that of strictly hyperbolic systems. Strictly hyperbolic, which means that for every xi, A of xi is real diagonalizable, and if I restrict to non-zero xi, then it has simple eigenvalues. In this case, you can follow the eigenvalues continuously, and using the compactness of the unit sphere here, you can prove not only the eigenvalues, actually, you can follow also the eigenvectors. You can prove well conditioning because the unit sphere is compact. It's a bit more involved, but not that much. And you can generalize this class by asking only that A of xi is real diagonalizable, and the list of multiplicities of eigenvalues, this list does not depend on xi when xi is non-zero. This is important because this happens, for instance, in gas dynamics. Although the eigenvalues are not all of them simple. Well, perhaps I give you two examples. I begin with Maxwell's equations. For electromagnetism, so in appropriate units, you have ampere and I never remember. Okay, you have two laws. one of which is dTB. Faraday on ampere, yes. So dTB plus curl of E equals 0, and if you assume a vacuum, then the other equation is dTE minus curl of B equals 0. Then if you compute the symbol matrix A of xi, first of all, you have D equals 3 and N equals 6. 6 because you have 6 unknowns, 3 components for B, 3 components for E, and you obtain a matrix A of xi, which writes blockwise. As an off-diagonal matrix. So here you have 0, 3, and 0, 3, that these are the diagonal blocks, and then J of Xi with its transpose is actually its opposite. J of Xi is the matrix such that for every vector in R3, the image of X under this matrix is the vector product of Xi and X. So it is a skew symmetric matrix. Right. So this belongs, this is a symmetric matrix, and therefore the Maxwell's equations form a Friedrich symmetric system. Now, very close to Maxwell's equations, of course, you have the wave equation, which is a scalar second order equation in that case, which is dt utt minus Laplacian u equals 0. And here p of tau on xi is tau square minus xi square with roots, with real roots, tau are equal to plus or minus norm of xi. Okay. And perhaps you prefer to have a c square here. In that case, I shall put a c square and here a c, just for cosmetic reasons. And now it is time to speak of waves. Of course, I give you verifying that the Laplace equation in space and time is not hyperbolic. Actually, hyperbolic and elliptic, they are not opposite to each other, but they are incompatible as far as you have at least two independent variables. So if d is larger than or equal to 1, then intersection of hyperbolic and elliptic operators is void. On the contrary, if d equals 0 and you are in the ODE case, because you have only the time variable, then you do not distinguish. All operators are elliptic, all operators are hyperbolic. Actually, you have only linear equations in time. And hyperbolic or elliptic, this just means that the ODE is non-singular. I mean, when you have variable coefficients, this is an assumption that the ODE is non-singular. Okay. Well, I think it is an important remark, but because for a while people did not understand very well the multidimensional case, because in one space variable some problems were written as ODE problems, in which you cannot distinguish hyperbolicity and ellipticity. So waves. So the fact that P vanishes, so there is a characteristic set in the set of frequencies, tau xi. So this is non-void. This is non-void because you have roots. Okay, you have roots tau when you give xi. So this allows us to construct some planar waves. So let Xi be given in Rd, tau a root of P of tau Xi equals 0. Then, if you consider a function given as, well, which depends only on one linear variable, that is tau t plus xi dot xi, a scalar product, then this is always a solution of the equation, of the homogeneous equation. So P of dt gradient u equals 0. And this does not depend on phi. So it is true for every function phi, and actually it is even true for every distribution phi. If you take a distribution in one variable, then this defines a distribution in several variables, and this distribution is a distributional solution of the equation. Now, a way to construct general solutions, more general solutions of this equation, of the homogeneous equation, is just to take a family here which depends on tau and xi, and to integrate with respect to some measure of tau and xi. And if you define a function u of xt that way, then by superposition principle, you still have a solution of the homogeneous equation. Now, this includes convolution in terms of tau and xi variables, of course, and you know that by playing that game, you can start here from very singular solutions. For instance, such a solution can be discontinuous along a hyperplane, because phi could be, for instance, a Heaviside function. So these solutions, individually, they may be very rough, very singular, and when you integrate with respect to mu, you can receive something which is very regular, even C infinity. Okay? This depends only on properties of mu. If the support of mu is sufficiently large, in particular if it is open, and the density of mu is smooth, then you will get a smooth function u here, say that u depends on mu. Okay, but if mu if mu is not so nice, if the support of mu is not an open set, but is only a submanifold, for instance, a codimension 1 submanifold, then when you proceed to this integration, what you receive is a function which is still singular, but it will be singular along a submanifold which will be the envelope of the hyperplanes where the phi's are singular, as xi and tau vary along the manifold which supports mu. So you may also construct singular solutions whose singular support, the singular front, is not a hyperplane, but it is something more complicated. Often it will be a submanifold. And typically it is the envelope of some characteristic hyperplanes. Characteristic hyperplanes are tau t plus xi dot x equals constant when tau xi is a solution, is in the characteristic set. So this may be singular, or maybe singular along an envelope of hyperplanes tau t plus xi dot x equals some constant depending on tau and xi. The envelope. I am a bit embarrassed because it is true that when I was a student, we were taught what was an envelope, and I know that our students in French are not anymore taught that. So it must be the same in other countries, and I really think that it is a pity. But this is differential geometry, so perhaps now I switch to a differential geometry course. No, I answer. I'll describe just the envelope of a family, one parameter family of lines in the plane. So suppose you are in the plane, R2, and you have lines, straight lines, okay, and they depend on one parameter. And now you go to Queen's College, and you see the envelope. No? That's true. You know the famous mathematical bridge. The famous mathematical bridge is called that way because the bridge has been, okay, the bottom part of the bridge is a curve, approximately an arc of circle, but actually the bridge is built only with lines. So they have chosen 7 tangents to the curve, and they have used 7 logs, and they arrange them, and this makes the structure of the bridge, which looks to be approximately circular, but actually it is only piecewise linear because you have just tangents. If they had done that with an infinite number of logs, then you really would have a circular arch. Okay, as here, if I really draw every lines which depend on a continuous parameter, then I obtain the envelope, which is a curve. Now you can do the same with planes or hyperplanes instead of lines if you are in higher dimension, and depending on the number of parameters on which the spaces depend, you receive a hypersurface with various geometrical properties. Okay. Now, this is quite a nice situation because I have so far assumed that the coefficients of the equation were constant, but if the coefficients are non-constant, the situation is much more complicated. I mean, if you are interested in singular France. So perhaps, let me summarize what I mentioned here. So the equation PU equals 0 admits rough solutions whose singular set, the set of singularities is it has the property, well, is such that its tangent set is characteristic. Tangent. No, it's normal set. Tangent, normal. Well, now the situation when the coefficients are non-constant is more complicated. The coefficients are non-constant. So you have an equation where the polynomial p depends also on t on x explicitly. Maybe it's not polynomial in t on x, but it is polynomial in dt on in the derivatives. Okay. Now in this case, you form the Hamiltonian. It is just the symbol. So h of tx and tau c. So this is just p of tx and tau c, but because it is a Hamiltonian, people prefer to call it h. And now, what you can say is that if u is a solution, then its singular support, well, now I apologize because this is a terminology of pseudo-differential operators. And the singular support is not just a subset of a physical domain, that is the domain in time and space, but it is a subset of product of the physical domain and the tangent space, actually the dual of a tangent space, so with coordinates t, x, tau, and xi. So the singular support, first of all, is contained in h equals 0, and then it is invariant under the flow of the Hamiltonian equation, which is that the Hamiltonian equation is an ODE in all the variables t, x, tau c. So the derivatives of t on x with respect to a parameter, actually you can take t as a parameter, but it's not necessary. So it is dh with respect to d tau and xi, which means tau dot is dh d tau, x dot is dh d xi, and tau dot xi dot is minus dh of dtx. Of course, this differential equation is compatible with constraint h equals 0. If you solve this equation from an initial point that was contained in h equals 0, then the whole trajectory will still be contained in h equals 0. Okay. And this is the only way to understand what is the singular support when you know it at initial time. So let me give an example, a very simple example with a wave equation. Of course, this result is also useful in constant coefficients equations. For example, wave equation. So you have dtu square minus Laplacian u equals 0, minus C2. So h is tau square minus xi square. And when you write the differential equation here, by the way, these curves are called, these integral curves are called bicharacteristics. You have a C2 here. So you have T dot equals 2 tau, x dot equals minus 2 c square xi, tau dot equals 0 and xi dot equals 0. So tau and xi are constant. And therefore you find that dx dt, which is x dot divided by t dot, equals minus c2 xi over tau. And this is constant. And this constant vector has a norm that you can compute, because remember you must have tau square minus c square xi square equals 0. So you have also tau equals, in absolute value, c times the norm of xi. And therefore this nu is a constant vector, and perhaps I shall put a c in front of it, because now nu is minus 6c over tau, and it is a unit vector. So the result is that in the bicharacteristics, you have x of t equals the initial point x0 plus ct nu. So in this case, the bicharacteristics is a straight line, and singularities propagate along lines at velocity c. So c is the speed of waves. Of course, you may think of singularities as light. So these are light rays. So this calculation was extremely simple, but of course you could do it also if the coefficients are non-zero, or if your system is more complicated, then you will always get a result, an explicit result, a descriptive one. For instance, if C depends on X, then you will see that the light rays are not straight lines, and therefore the light is bended because the medium is non-uniform. Okay. So this is an interesting, this is always an interesting calculation. Well, so far there is no free boundary. So I have to justify my invitation. And the free boundaries will come when looking at nonlinear problems. So for free boundaries, you need nonlinear problems. Fortunately, there are a lot of nonlinear problems in physics, in mechanics, and those in which I am interested have the form that dtu plus the divergence of some nonlinear function of u is 0. So f is prescribed, of course. U is still vector valued. X is still in Rd. Now, this is nonlinear. And the first observation is that constants are solutions. Because you just derivate constants and this gives 0. Okay? And in this case, it is natural to think that if the Cauchy problem is well posed, then in particular the linearized Cauchy problem about these explicit solutions must be well posed. Okay. So need that the linearized Cauchy problem perhaps in England I should put an S here. Is well posed. So the linearized Cauchy problem is just dtv plus the sum of d alpha a alpha v equals 0, where a alpha is df alpha du, the Jacobian matrix. I have linearized about some constant state u bar, so that a alpha depends on u bar, but for the linearized problem, it is a constant matrix. So we have the natural assumption that that the hypothesis of Kreis theorem are satisfied. That is, A of xi is real diagonalizable for every xi in a uniform way. Okay. A of xi, actually it is A of u bar xi, because the A alpha depend on u bar. So to assume that it is real diagonalizable with an S uniformly. So uniformly in xi and presumably also uniformly, locally uniformly in u bar. Okay. So let me give you two examples. So the simplest is the one in the smallest space dimension, d equals 1, the smallest size of a system, n equals 1, and the simplest nonlinearity f, that is u square. Okay. So dtu plus dx of u square, and for cosmetic reasons I divide by 2. And this is called the Burger's equation. And I warn you that in Burger's equation, the S is not a genitive. Okay, it is a part of the name of a mathematician. No, I have seen so many times it written with R, how do you call that? Prime? Okay, I don't know. And then the S. And this is a wrong, this is very wrong. Okay. Fortunately, I have never met him in these circumstances. And the second example look much more involved. It is gas dynamics. So gas dynamics is composed by the equation of conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, and conservation of energy. So conservation of mass, momentum, linear momentum, and energy. So the conservation of mass writes that the time derivative of the mass density plus the divergence of rho, let me write V for the particle velocities, the fluid velocity. Okay. Conservation of momentum is dt of rho v plus the divergence. Well, you remark that sometimes I write the divergence with a small d. It is the ordinary divergence of a field, vector field. And sometimes with a capital letter. In this case, I mean that I am writing a vector valued equation, and therefore the divergence is rho-wise, is the rho-wise divergence of some matrix. Okay? So here, it is a symmetric matrix that is rho v tensor v. V tensor v is the rank 1 matrix with entries v alpha, v beta. And then there is the gradient of the pressure equals 0. And finally, the conservation of energy is dt of 1/2 rho v square, the norm to the square. So this is the kinetic part of the energy density plus the bulk part of the energy density, rho times E. So E is the specific energy per unit mass, specific internal energy per unit mass, plus the divergence of, so this I shall denote it capital E for the total mechanical energy, mechanical energy density, of course. And here you have E plus P V equals 0. This looks very messy, I apologize. Now, I left some room here to say that P depends on rho and E, and the way it depends on rho and E depends on the gas. Okay, so there is an equation of state which characterizes the gas. And the most popular, I can do that. That's much better for you, I think. Yeah, maybe. So there is an equation of state, and the most popular is that of a polytropic gas, which writes a constant times rho E. So this is a constant with gamma larger than 1. Gamma is the so-called adiabatic constant. Okay. In general, it is a rational fraction, at least for gases made of simple molecules. Well, Perhaps it's not obvious at the beginning, but this is a first order system of conservation laws in this sense. But first of all, this is a term DTU if you accept to define U to be rho v, which I shall denote m like momentum, okay, and E. And this is a divergence term, even the gradient is a divergence term, okay, where all the quantities inside the divergence can be expressed explicitly in terms of U. Even if this explicit expression is not very, very nice. I can give you other, okay, I list other domains where such systems of conservation laws occur. For instance, nonlinear Maxwell's equations. This is not just a mathematical game, this is real physics for two reasons. If you have a material medium, then in this material medium, the equations of electromagnetism might not be linear. This is the case when you have polarization and so forth. But also, even in the vacuum, or in almost vacuum, the linear Maxwell's equation have a paradox in it, because the energy, the electromagnetic energy of a point charge turns out to be infinite in the linear model. And this is not acceptable. And for this reason, there were many attempts to modify the Maxwell's equation to take in account this difficulty. And one of the nonlinear models that has been proposed, which makes sense actually, is the Born-Infeld model. So Born is Max Born, and Infeld, Leopold Infeld, was the assistant of Einstein. This is quite an interesting system. And then I should mention also elastodynamics. And now you can mix two of them. For instance, you can mix gas dynamics with Maxwell's equations, and you obtain magnetohydrodynamics. Magnetohydrodynamics is one of the most involved system of conservation laws, and you have a specialist there. Now, what are the difficulties? There are many. I mean additional difficulties. Of course, they are nonlinear, but if you work in elliptic equations, you have been long working on nonlinear elliptic equations. If you work only on elliptic equation, I don't think you will be you will get a good career now. So a priori, nonlinearity should not be a problem. It should be, on the contrary, it should be interesting, and it is. Certainly, it is. But the problem here is that you do not have, okay, this system of conservation laws does not write as a linear principal part equals some compact perturbation, compact lower order, okay, lower order perturbation. in some sense, it is different from semi-linear wave equations. Semi-linear wave equations have this form, okay, and they have been studied intensively in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 10s, 20s, 30s, so forth. But you can study them using the Duhamel's principle. So here there is no Duhamel principle. And this was the main tool for the semi-linear equation. So these equations are not semi-linear, but they are quasi-linear. So quasi-linear means that if you formally develop this equation, you arrive to dtu plus the sum over alpha of A alpha of u, the Jacobian matrices, d alpha u equals 0. And now it is linear in the first order derivatives, which are the higher order derivatives. But it is non-linear because the coefficients of the d alpha u depend on u itself. So this is what we call quasi-linear. It should be fully non-linear if this term was not linear in the first derivatives. But here they are always linear in the first derivatives. Also, the wave propagation becomes much harder than what I have described here. So wave propagation is much harder because of the following. Because you have seen that here, for instance, the velocity of propagation depends on the roots of the hyperbolic polynomial. But in our case, the hyperbolic polynomial will be p of tau and xi equals the determinant of tau identity plus a of u and xi. And actually, u is the solution. So p depends on u itself, which means that the wave velocities depends on u. And u is the unknown. Even in the simplest case, that of the Burger's equation, this causes a major change comparing to the linear situation. So, example, the Burger's equation. So I remind you, dtu plus dxu square over 2 equals 0. So suppose that u is a smooth solution. So if u is smooth, you develop and you have dtu plus u dxu equals 0. And you try to follow characteristics. In one space dimensions, it is enough to consider characteristics instead of bi-characteristics. It is a simpler theory and it works quite well. So follow characteristics. Here, this means that you look at this equation and you recognize a transport equation. That is, it writes ddt of u equals 0, provided that you differentiate u along a curve, and the curve is defined by dx dt equals u. Because then you apply the chain rule, and this is exactly that. Now, of course, u of x and t. Now, the first equation tells you that u is constant along the curve, and therefore this is a constant number, which means that x is just a straight line with constant velocity. So we find u of xt and t equals the initial data. Say that the initial data was the function a, u of x and 0 equals a of x. Okay. So this is a of x0, where x0 is the initial value of capital X. And then from the second equation, you find that x of t equals x0 plus t times this constant velocity. That is a of x0. So thanks to this calculation, you obtain u in an implicit way through the following formula. This formula in which you replace x of t by this quantity. So u implicitly defined by u of x0 plus t a of x0 t equals a of x0. And now there is an abstraction, and the abstraction is that unless a is an increasing function, unless a is increasing, there is a capital T finite, such that when t is larger than capital T, the map y gives y plus t a of y, which is used there, is not one-to-one. For small t, there is no problem, because for small t, this is an increasing function. The derivative with respect to y is 1 plus t a prime. If a prime is bounded, which is the case often, then for small t, this is strictly positive for every y, and the map is just a diffeomorphism of the real line. But when t increases, there happens times for which this is not anymore a one-to-one map, which means that there exists y1 and y2, such that, for instance, these are equal at y1 and y2. And you obtain a contradiction that is u, and this, let me call this an x bar. Okay. You find that u of x bar t must equal to a of y1, but also to a of y2. And there is no reason why this should be true. Actually, it is false. Okay. So there is a contradiction here, And the way it is solved, well, this is a long history with a huge theory. The theory is reminiscent to thermodynamics, to the second principle of thermodynamics. So first of all, we must accept that solutions may be just bounded and discontinuous. Accept that solutions may be L infinity with discontinuities typically. And in this case, when you have discontinuities, you write the equation in the distributional sense. So you will have somewhere, and actually along curves, you will have discontinuities. So here U has two limit values on left and right. And when you write the equation, I write it just for the Burgers equation. You will have U plus square over 2 minus U minus square over 2. That is the jump of the flux equals to the velocity. So this is x equals y over t. The velocity dy dt of the discontinuity times the jump of u itself. The jump of u because it is the term in the time derivative. There is an analogous statement for more general systems of conservation laws. Now, because you have a discontinuity, u minus is different from u plus, you may simplify, divide by u plus minus u minus, and you find u plus plus u minus over 2. The velocity of the discontinuity is u plus plus u minus over 2. Remark one important thing that if the discontinuity is weak, that is, if u plus and u minus are close to each other, then this is approximately u minus or u plus. And remember that u was precisely the velocity of characteristics. So small shocks, those for which u minus and u plus are close to each other, they travel approximately at the characteristic speed. Now, shocks, we call them shocks in general, they are free boundaries because you cannot predict their positions a priori. Well, in the case of a Burgers equation, you could do that, but because it is a very simple equation, this is an exercise in the case of a Burgers equation. But it is false as soon as you consider systems. That is, as soon as you have n larger than or equal to 2. And also, it is even worse when you have systems in several space dimensions. So I am just out of my time, and I finally pronounced the word free boundary. So I shall stop. Well, I'm not sure. First of all,
5 minutes.
5 minutes. What should I say? Perhaps I should say that, of course, the non-linear case cannot be simplest than the linear one with constant coefficients. That's clear. You have seen the description, which was quite involved, the description of singular support in the linear case. Even if that was not very difficult in the case of the wave equation, the general statement was complicated in terms of bicharacteristics. So of course, here it is even more complicated because these are free boundaries. So there is not even a similar calculation as one along bicharacteristics to describe the evolution of a shock. Now, one could think, okay, but you told us that when U minus and U plus are close to each other, then the discontinuity evolves almost in the characteristic way. Yeah, almost. And actually this raises another difficulty because it is harder to work with an almost characteristic surface or hypersurface. It is harder to deal with that than to deal with either a characteristic hypersurface, because this you can try to compute it by means of bicharacteristics. And it is also harder than working on very non-characteristic hypersurfaces. Well, that's always the case. For instance, the Cauchy problem along characteristic hypersurfaces is very badly posed, and we have similar difficulties here. When hypersurfaces are almost characteristics, then along the computations you will face divisions by quantities which tend to vanish or to be very small. So you encounter a small divisors problem. And this is quite bad. So this is one point. And perhaps the last point, if I have 5 minutes, is where hyperbolicity meets hyperbolic equations meet elliptic equations. Well, you do not need to go very far. For instance, let's go back to the wave equation. If you have the wave equation, then some special solutions are interesting. For instance, steady equations, or more generally, what we call fundamental states. So fundamental states are solutions U of xt of the form exponential I omega t times a function phi of x. And they are solution of minus Laplacian phi equals omega 2 phi. And this is a Helmholtz equation. Okay. Even if you have some nonlinear, some semi-linearity here, it will be okay. Here you will have just f of phi times phi. Okay. And this is an elliptic equation. Now, more interesting is the case of self-similar solutions. I'll choose the following kind of self-similarity. First of all, let me assume the wave equation just. Well, you remark that this equation is scaling invariant. If you make a dilation of space and time, you do not change the equation. So this suggests that the solution depends on x over t, but you can also multiply by some power of t, and the most relevant one is t here, is just t to the first power. And then you solve the wave equation if and only if the Hessian matrix of U in the direction, so I shall write y for the x over t variable, for the self-similar variable. So all the derivatives here are with respect to y, because capital U depends only on y. So the Hessian matrix of y taken in the direction of y itself minus Laplacian of U equals 0. So the Laplacian just comes from this one, while this strange term, which is the sum of y alpha, y beta, d alpha, d beta, u. Okay? These terms come from the second time derivative. Now, what is the type of this equation? It turns out that the type depends on y, because the symbol is just y times xi to the square, the scalar product of y and xi, minus the square of the norm. So this depends on y and xi. Now this is a quadratic form. If it is negative definite, then the equation is elliptic, and this is the case for y less than 1. So P is negative definite, and the equation is elliptic. While if capital Y is larger than 1, then the quadratic form P has the type of Lorentz. Okay, it has one positive direction and the other one's negative. And this is typically a hyperbolic polynomial. When a polynomial is second order, then of second degree, then it is hyperbolic in some direction, if and only if this quadratic form has the type 1 n minus 1. Okay. So the signature is 1 of P is 1d minus 1, and this is the hyperbolic case. Actually, it is hyperbolic in the radial direction, that is in the direction of y. Okay, and therefore you have a transition from the hyperbolic to the elliptic type on the unit sphere. And of course, this raises some difficulties. It is always more difficult to work with an equation or a system whose type changes across some interface than to work on an equation or a system whose type is well defined. And this we encounter always that in the study of systems of conservation laws when we look at the so-called Riemann problem, which is the Cauchy problem with self-similar initial data. And it is very important in our domain, and we always encounter such difficulties with changing type systems. But in the nonlinear case, we do not know in advance where the type will change. Here, the interface between the hyperbolic and the elliptic regime is a free boundary. In the case of nonlinear conservation laws. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
In this last part, problem is when this variable py zeta zeta. I don't know how.
Yes, here you have variable coefficients.
I mean, when y is equal to zeta, there is the problem, not when on the unit sphere. When
On the unit sphere, yes, on the unit sphere, there is only one direction in which p vanishes. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
but then
Well, but this always happens.
change.
Hmm?
Then on this all points where it's then
Yeah.
the psi is not equal to y. What is the type? And what is it?
When the type is changing, it is difficult to speak about the type.
Here itself, except this point. What is it?
Yeah, we cannot really say. Yeah.
Where you have to classify
No,
the
but it's
geometry.
degenerate at this point. The other.
Yes,
Yes,
It's also
yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah. Well, I forgot to mention that in this case, when we consider self-similar solutions, then we look at self-similar equations of a Cauchy problem, which means that for little u, we have an initial data. An initial data means t tends to 0 plus, and this converts at the level of capital U as a data at infinity, because t tends to 0 is equivalent to y goes to infinity. So for this problem, the data is at infinity. It is the limit of capital U at infinity in every direction. This limit is prescribed. So this is the kind of problem that we have to solve. It is a kind of boundary problem, but with data at infinity. Yes.
What is how large is this set when elliptic and hyperbolic set when they meet? How big
How
is
large? I
large
mean, in
dimension and as a set?
in the set of differential operators,
No, in the domain.
in the physical domain, x and t. In general, the hyperbolic domain is unbounded. This is a general rule that if y is large enough, then the system is hyperbolic in the radial direction. That is in the direction of y itself.
So it's a complete boundary when they meet. It can be n minus 1 or n dimensional boundary. Yes? It's a complete
Yes,
surface. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, yes.
Yeah, elliptical is all the bounded.
But the picture can be more complicated. Here, I choose just the wave equation. But if I had chosen gas dynamics, then in the compact part, where the self-similar system is not hyperbolic, I cannot say that it is elliptic, because it is now mixed hyperbolic elliptic. Because what happens is that you have a symbol which still has the same degree as before. In the case of gas dynamics, the degree is 5. There is a triple root and two other roots, and in the hyperbolic part they are real, and in the non-hyperbolic part they are complex conjugated, which means that the system is not fully elliptic, but it is mixed elliptic hyperbolic. And this is even worse because everything is coupled.
What is the optimal regularity of the functions across?
That's a good question. We don't know. We don't know, except in the scalar case. And if we had the answer to your question, we could go forward in the Cauchy, in the theory of a Cauchy problem. In several space dimensions, we still don't know which functional space is appropriate for the Cauchy problem.
Do you have examples on homogeneous solutions, like in space-time?
Homogeneous solution. We have some self-similar solutions.
Yeah, so
For
what are,
instance.
what are the scales?
But they are not too bad, but they are special.
What are the scalings for them? The order of homogeneity.
The only scale that we have is the scaling in space and time.
The order of the scaling.
You mean the type of singularities?
Yeah, so regular.
Well, because we lack a functional context, a good functional context. When we construct some special solutions, they are always piecewise smooth. They are typically the worst that we encounter is first-order discontinuities of the field. In the case of nonlinear wave equations, this would be discontinuities of the first derivatives. But otherwise, in gas dynamics, we expect to encounter at worst discontinuities of density, velocity, temperature across hypersurfaces. But probably this is too optimistic because there must be some manifestation of turbulence. But so far we cannot know. Even numerical experiments are not very helpful to predict what kind of singularities we could encounter. So this domain is still in its infancy, except in one space dimension or in the scalar case, we know very little about the Cauchy problem.
Do you know any kind of what kind of scalings you can make? I mean, the order of scaling in X and T. Is that too many, or?
No, I think that you have in mind the scalings that are used, for instance, for the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations, or some other equations where we can speak of sub and super critical equations. But we don't have that here because all the derivatives have the same order. For instance, we don't have such numbers as Reynolds number. This does not exist in this domain. If you add some viscosity, some heat conduction in the gas dynamics system, for instance, that is, if instead of considering the Euler equations, those that I have written, you consider the compressible Navier-Stokes equations or Navier-Stokes Fourier equations, then you do have such numbers as the Reynolds number, and scaling could be of some help. But in our case, it seems out of question. I don't know if I understand well your question.
Well, if you have the answer, then you probably have the regularity as well.
So you mean scaling the transition boundary from elliptical hyperbolic?
Yeah, I was thinking of what is the invariant scaling at those points.
So I think I understand your question, and I gave you the answer. We don't have that tools, such tools here.
Yeah, some case C11, the tags itself
Mhm.
generally don't know, yeah. Okay, okay. There are a lot of rebounded problems. Most of them are very difficult. Okay, let's thank, Daniel will give a talk tomorrow, another talk tomorrow. Some kind of continuation, right?
Not exactly, otherwise I shall have nobody
Yeah.
in the audience.
So let's thank the again.